The Ressourcement, which means return to the sources, as Dr. Jason Paone recently told me, was a post World War movement of European theologians and philosophers who sought to renew Catholic intellectual life and create new dialogue with the world by calling new scholarly attention to the scriptures and the ancient and medieval fathers and doctors of the church. With Word on Fire's new academic journal, the New Ressourcement, he went on, we hope to provide an outlet and an inspiration for a new movement in Catholic thought, a new return to the sources that will breathe life into the Catholic Academy and intelligentsia, and in turn, reinvigorate Catholic culture and its witness to the world. Dr. Jason Paone on Word on Fire's flagship academic journal, the New Ressourcement, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Dr. Jason Paone is the editor of Word on Fire Academic. He studied the classics and philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin, where he received a Bachelor of Arts degree in 2015. In 2017, he received a Master of Theological Studies at Duke Divinity School. He received a graduate fellowship from the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, where he completed a doctorate in historical and systematic theology in the spring of 2024. Under Reinhard Hutter, he wrote a dissertation entitled Obedient Belief, the Act of Faith and the Problem of Doxastic Voluntarism in the Theology of Matthias Joseph Schieben. Jason lives in Dallas, Texas with his wife and 3 children. Jason, welcome.
Thank you, Todd. It's great to be here.
Segment 1, Meet Jason Paone. In an interview for Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute, Jason Paone explained, quote, I was born and raised in a sectarian evangelical movement that worked very hard to isolate its members from the world, including, perhaps especially, the Christian world. By this, I mean Christian Europe's extraordinary intellectual and cultural legacy. I didn't get to read many books as a young person, and that's part of the story of how I ended up in graduate school. By accident, in my early 20s, I encountered a very powerful book that changed my life. So, Jason, when you have a lead off like that, we got to know, what was that book and how did it change your life?
The book was C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. It's a sort of well-known, well-loved book among evangelicals and Catholics too, I think. It changed my life because, in the first place, because it was just such a rich book. Um, the world that I grew up in, because it was so secluded and cut off from the literature and from the arts, it had to sort of rely on its own creativity, imagination, and culture, which was relatively, necessarily much more meager. Just didn't really produce any great literary work or any great, cultural productions of any kind. And so the most striking thing initially about Mere Christianity was just the richness of it. Here was this well articulated, um, beautifully rhetorically beautiful argument. The whole book was just this consistent kind of argument that traversed all of these vignettes of Christian Catholic history, or not Catholic, Christian history, I should say.
Yeah.
Um, and it was just so rich with tradition. There was so much in it. It was drawing from a far deeper well than the world that I had grown up in. And that was the thing that first caught my attention, and and it sustained my attention. And that I read that book so many times. I learned so much about the Christian tradition, things that had been sort of purged away from the sectarian movement that I grew up in, that over time, is part of this historical tradition that sort of carved and carved and carved and bared down Christianity to a certain set of really bare bones principles, and sort of just lost its beauty and its richness. Um, and I realized I knew almost nothing about the Christian faith, even though I had purportedly grown up and been raised like a Christian, and we sort of profess to be like the best Christians, the most, the true Christians,
Right.
But there was so little that I knew about this tradition and its history. that sort of immediately drew me in. And I kept reading that book, and it sort of led me to other books, and it led me to read the Bible in new ways and with new eyes. So it just sort of like set off this whole intellectual development that has been continuing ever since.
It's an incredible story. I think it was, I think C.S. Lewis actually said it of Chesterton, if I'm not mistaken. And again, this is a different story because you weren't an atheist to begin with, but I think Lewis had once said that, effectively every atheist should be careful, very, very careful and guarded of what they read.
That's
Because
right.
you
Yeah.
just never know when God's going to slither
Yeah.
in, and it was, I think, him reading, I think, Chesterton's the Everlasting Man, that opened him up to the journey, his greater and fuller journey into the
Yeah.
Christian faith. Now, clearly, you started from a different place and have emerged as a Catholic and so on. But this
Yeah.
seems like Mere Christianity seems like it was the gateway, if I may say so. It was a
Hmm.
gateway book that opened you up to this entire intellectual, philosophical, and theological tradition. Which gets us to this incredible academic journey. I mean, University of Texas, Austin, Duke Divinity School, Catholic University of America. I mean, what an incredible academic pedigree.
Thank
So
you.
moving from your initial, immersion in mere Christianity into all of this, I read the title of your dissertation, which I had to look up a doxastic to see what exactly
Yeah.
that meant. It shows how far and wide you've read and how far you've come. What became of your faith particularly as you immersed yourself in philosophy and theology along the way?
Yeah, I think that my faith was sort of starved and emaciated by, the Bible says, or the New Testament says, like, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind. I think that's Matthew 22.
Mm,
Um, but it's like if you try to love God with just your heart, or with just your mind, or
mm,
just your soul, whatever that means. Um, you, you can't do any one of those very well on its own. And I found that my faith in God was just immature and weak because my understanding and my sort of intellectual engagement with God was just malformed and had never begun. So that's the thing that really took off then, and it sort of um, gave a whole new kind of impetus to my broader spiritual life. And I sort of developed in a direction that ultimately led me to the Catholic Church. John Henry Newman often talks about how Anglicanism can be like this halfway house
mm.
between the Catholic Church and atheism. And people can kind of go go
Yeah.
through it one way or the other.
Yeah.
And for me, it was that was certainly the case.
This is this I love the story of a deeper, wider, richer reading bring you further and further into faith. I think there's a lot of people out there who have walked away from faith because they think it's irrelevant, it's a fairy tale, it's stodgy, it's overly political, whatever the case may be, and they leave it unexplored. To borrow from again Chesterton, he said about the Christian ideal, but I would say, the Catholic Church has not been tried and found wanting; it's been found
Hmm.
difficult and left
Right.
untried. That many people just kind of they stop at the water's edge and say, well, I just don't like this, and so therefore I'm going to walk away. Again, Chesterton's the one who I think said, once you begin to be fair to the Catholic Church, you
Hmm.
start to become fond of it. I'm not trying to keep quoting Chesterton, but
Sure.
he's so apt
Yeah, he's very
for
quotable.
right. So I love this journey, the story of a journey from somebody with the intellectual wattage like you, that the deeper you immersed yourself into great readings, the more confirmed you were in your faith, and the more you arrived ultimately at the doorsteps of the Catholic Church. Along the way, obviously, outside of books, there's also mentors that come along the way, and
Hmm.
you've been in some unbelievable institutions. Tell me about some of the religious or academic mentors along the way, and if is there any one bit of wisdom that was relatively pivotal that came from one or the other that kind of led you to where you are today?
Yeah, it's there. I really can't overstate the importance of the Christian, um, sort of examples that I've had along the way. In Austin, when I was attending University of Texas at Austin, I met a great, terrific Anglican priest there, or Episcopal priest. His name is Matt Bolter. He's the godfather of my daughter,
Mm,
and he was just there was something, alive about this man. He was just so full of wisdom and so full of energy, enthusiasm. There's this concept in in ancient moral thought called flourish. We translated in English to flourishing, human flourishing.
Mm,
And I think what I saw in him and others, when I was entering into my faith and entering into the church, deeper and deeper, was just this flourishing quality that people seem to have, and I wanted it so desperately. I came from a world where everything was broken, where
mm,
relationships were torn apart, where children were angry with their parents, and there was no community. Everyone sort of was constantly moving away from each other, kind of like the way that C.S. Lewis describes hell in The Great Divorce. It's this ever expanding ghost town where people are not only unfit and uninterested in God, but they're also unfit and uninterested in each other. And so the space between the individuals just continues to expand, and the people themselves become narrower and narrower in their preoccupations, and they're sort of dying forever. It's sort of like death in a deeper sense than just like biological death. The flourishing is dissipating and dissipating and dissipating. And that attrition just goes on forever and ever. But it's a sort of I just sort of caught a sense of this kind of flourishing life that some people seem to have, and especially in some of these Christian examples. But I had terrific Catholic mentors very early on. I learned to deeply respect. I had a mentor named Robert Coons, and I sort of got into Jay Budjezewski at University of Texas. Those two professors were very influential on me. Um, and then at Duke, Reinhard Hooter, as I mentioned in my interview, he sort of became kind of a spiritual father to me at a moment where, Duke was going through a lot of culture war stuff. There were a lot of protests going on campus. It was kind of a difficult place to find a quiet place to study and actually learn about theology. You sort of had to get into a fight instead. And Dr. Hooter was just such a voice of reason for me. And he was sort of he played a tremendous role in keeping me on that path. Otherwise, I probably, Duke might have driven me away from theology for good at that point. But yeah, and Dr. Hooter, I saw just a great example again of the Christian flourishing that I had seen in others, and also this rich intellectual. At some points at Duke, I sort of found that there was also a kind of closed off. You sort of there's a certain progressive element that sort of wants to do theology so that they can do something else, some kind of political thing. And to me, that kind of that or some kind of like polemical thing. Um, the purpose of theology, there's like a pragmatic thing behind it, a real like
mm,
something else other than some non-speculative thing kind of driving the program. Um, and that to me was just really disappointing.
yeah.
But seeing in Dr. Hooter this genuine kind of faith and speculative, real deep philosophical, theological interest in truth for truth's sake, and not for the sake of some kind of political program or polemic or something like that. That was the thing that kind of kept me on the course and kind of especially encouraged me to move towards the Catholic Church.
It's an amazing story. It's interesting when we think about in my line of work, teaching medical students and residents, we talk a lot about how when you're learning, it's not just book work; it's you're learning, with attending physicians and you're seeing them break bad news, make tough
Oh
diagnoses,
wow.
run an efficient day, and so on. And if
Hmm.
you're doing it right as a student or a resident, you should tear pages from that person's book and put it into your own, to
Hmm.
integrate it and now be your own self, but have a book that's compiled with pages from other people,
Hmm.
little aspects of what to do right, what you could do better. how to do it, how this person's style can be, become a little bit of your own. And the point being is that it sounds like you clearly had, as you just mentioned, from your advisors to the godfather of your child and so on. You've had people who you've not only been able to tear pages from their books and integrate them into your own, but who've been models of human flourishment. When you mention human flourishment, and I know you're still a young man, Jason, but I was going to say, are you getting a taste of that? You said you wanted some of that. You were drawn, you gravitated towards that. Are you getting a taste of that human flourishing at this point in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably not as flourishing as the people that I've been following, but immediately it changes your life when you aspire. When like, I think one of the things that is great about being a Christian or anything, if you have some uh, religious tradition at all, or moral philosophy at all, I just think you are sort of worlds ahead of, unfortunately, so many people in our popular world, or popular in our society, that don't have a particular creed, or they don't have a philosophy that they commit themselves to, and they just don't have a definite anything that
Yeah,
defines their existence, a rule of life of any kind. And I think that just having some kind of moral aspiration, some definite moral aspiration, and some definite creed or philosophy that you live by, helps you see, it helps you aspire and work on yourself in some way, but it also helps you kind of see what you really are. You
yeah,
don't really know how much work there is to do until you try to do some, until you try to be
yeah,
someone, until you try to be worthy of your children and your wife. And Yeah, becoming a Christian, it was just this, in a way, it was a massive new, sort of news flash about
yeah,
myself, about what I was really made of, and how difficult it was. I always talk about aspiring to be a Christian, because it's just the most difficult thing to do, to follow
yeah,
Christ and be anything like Christ. But inevitably it does bear this fruit in your life, and it transforms so much of what you do. Yeah, so I'm grateful for the grace of God, for any good things that came out of that. But I do think that having this Christian aspiration, this the tremendous moral and spiritual and communal principles that guide our lives, is just such a huge blessing and such a gift itself.
well said. So, Jason, you've had this extraordinary academic path. You've met these mentors. You've become Catholic. Have a spouse, children. How did you find yourself working at Word on Fire, and especially as the editor of Word on Fire Academic?
Well, to tell the truth, it started in a moment of desperation, when our third child,
That's
my
where these
wife
things
was,
always start. It seems, right?
yeah. As a starving graduate student, I spent many hours and years working on the side as an editor for some of the scholars, and first as a TA, and then for some other scholars, writing indices, fixing up footnotes, doing a little copy editing, a little this and a little that. I got a lot of I got broke my teeth working on scholarly manuscripts while I was just on the side as a graduate student, because you got to do something to survive. Unfortunately, I also have my wife was, if you don't have a wife, like, going to graduate school is very difficult.
Yeah, yeah.
Your poverty comes like a thief in the night as soon as you set foot on that campus. But no, so when my third child was on the way, I just felt like I had to do something. I was kind of on the lookout, and then Matthew Levering, great friend and mentor that I haven't mentioned yet, who's he's been a tremendous inspiration and help in my life. He sent me a job posting from Word on Fire for a project manager position, and I've had some experience, like, in project management years ago in construction. And I thought maybe I was shooting from the hip. I thought I'd apply to it. So I applied to it, and Matthew Levering gave me a great recommendation,
Hmm.
too. And so they wrote back and said, "Look, you're clearly not the kind of person we're looking for this project manager role. But we see all your editing experience, and that's interesting to us. We've just created this academic publishing imprint, and we need someone like you to help us manage it. Would you be interested in doing that? And I was like, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So it's just this amazing, again, it's like the grace of God, because I
Yeah.
didn't, this really, this editorial thing wasn't even really on my radar. I was just doing it to kind of make some money on the side. But it's something that I really enjoy. And it's like my sensibility really match with the task of an editor. I'm kind of, um, I have a kind of, neurotic
Yeah.
personality that just gravitates to these idiosyncrasies and details that, um, so I get a crazy kind of satisfaction, fulfillment in correcting grammar errors, which is very weird.
I'm sorry for your children.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
No, I tease.
it's a, I'm not. Yeah, I correct them in their English and their Spanish all the time. So
Yeah, they're better for it. They're better for it. They got a great dad, a great editor. So Jason, so let's start. And before we get into the journal, tell people how. I mean, the Word on Fire Academic has been a freight train. I mean, just what you guys have produced so far, the incredible writers that you've been able to recruit, the meaningful narratives that have come out of the work, and the volume. How many books have you guys put out so far? Could you speak to that?
I think at this point we've got 10 out.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, I think it's 10. We've only been around for a couple of years. Really since I've been on board, I think 3 years. And it takes a little time for to get the word out that there is a publishing imprint, and it's
Hmm.
difficult at first to kind of, when you don't have a lot of clout as a publisher, a lot of reputation or
Right.
prestige. It's difficult to attract great manuscripts that are going to get you that prestige and reputation. But we've been fortunate to have some really terrific authors just come to us with great manuscripts, and we are happy to publish them. And it's the snowball has started. We're rolling. Our output every year is like increasing significantly, um, and we've got a ton of great books in the works. We've got one coming out by Daniel McInerney,
Mm.
on the topic of beauty. It's called Beauty and Imitation. Terrific book, and I'm confident that this is going to kind of change the whole field of philosophical aesthetics. It's just such a terrific book. Can't recommend it enough. Of course, I'm biased, but
Well,
yeah,
I'm blessed because that landed. I think an early copy of that landed on my doorstep already, and it is absolutely outstanding. And on top of that, we've interviewed on this podcast Daniel McInerney in the past, The Good Death of Kate Montclair. So if anybody wants to go back to the archives to listen
terrific.
to him, we're gonna bring him back. As soon as I saw him writing this one, I reached out. We're gonna bring him on for a future podcast. Are there a couple others that you want to highlight that have been released already so people can be on the lookout for them?
Yeah, we've got a lot of great books out there. We've published a couple of really great essay compilation books, essay collections. One by Father Robert and Belly,
Mm.
called Christ Brings All Newness. It's a terrific collection. Father Mbele is just such a wise, learned, articulate, stylish writer. In a lot of ways, he's a lot like Bishop Barron. He writes things. He recognizes that the form is often as important as the matter. It's the not just the content of what's being said, but how it's being said is so crucial. He's a priest and a very prayerful, thoughtful man. He reflects deeply on so much, like on books and so many aspects of culture, and on the 20th century history of the church in this book. And they're very readable essays that you can sort of take episodically, take them on one at a time. And um, I highly recommend that book. We've got another one in a way, it's kind of somewhat similar. And again, a terrific writer and a very profound thinker. Um, our recent book, it's called No Lasting City: Essays on Theology, Politics, and Culture by Frederick
Mm.
Christian Bowersmith. He's terrific. He's one of the deepest, most profound thinkers, I think, in the Catholic theological world today. Really, really profound essays in there. Really runs the gamut. He's a great kind of generalist. He's got his specialties as well, but he's a great generalist that has the gift of being able to draw like all of his learning or much of his learning together in everything he writes. That's a terrific another essay collection. It's very it's great. And then we've got another one, a number of books coming out. Another one by Frederick Christian Bauer Smith's coming out called Thinking Through Aquinas, and it's kind of another essay collection, kind of focused on Thomas Aquinas. Um, and then one that we're really excited about called Beyond Stoicism by Thomas Ward will be coming in October of this year, and it's a study and interpretation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. That's a terrific book. Very readable, very short, but rich, extremely rich. Highly recommended.
Did Thomas Ward write After Humanity? Did you guys publish that one, or is that a different Ward?
That's a different word.
Okay, okay. That just
Yeah.
there's a lot of books coming out of Word on Fire, and that's
Yeah.
another excellent one. Well, this is fantastic. So you're, and obviously the academic side, it has that much. I mean, every work coming out of Word on Fire is going to be vetted, edited, reviewed,
Peer
designed
reviewed.
to
Yes.
the umpteenth degree. What you're putting out is amazing, and the volume that is growing is amazing, and also, like you said, making your name for the wider academic community so that people can say, this is a good, high quality publishing house and so on. So then on top of all that, it's like, Jason, life isn't busy enough. You have 3 kids, you're married, you're doing all this editing work, you're getting it up and running. And then what was your reaction when you first realized that you would be creating and editing a new academic journal for Word on Fire? And any thoughts on trials and triumphs along the way in the genesis of the new Ressourcement journal?
Yeah, that's that. I loved the project. The when they hired me, they sort of gave me the mandate to create on some academic journal, and
Mm.
that was pretty much all the guidance that I got about what this academic journal was going to be. Um, and so I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about it, talking about it with scholars and friends, kind of looking at what else was out there in the Catholic academic journal space, where there was maybe a lacuna, what topics needed to be touched. What I was looking for a theme for the journal. And we tried out a lot of different things, thought about a lot of different things, but Matthew Levering proposed that the title, the new ressourcement, and it sort of fit what we had been kind of imagining the journal would be, which is kind of a lot of it is sort of just inspired by Bishop Barron's own sensibilities, as a
Mm.
theologian, as a culture critic, as a leader in the Catholic world. His approach to the past, the present, and the future, in a lot of ways, I think, when Matthew proposed the new ressourcement, thinking about it just seemed every moment that I thought about it, the more I realized like it's just perfect. It just encapsulated this general project that we were trying to name, you know,
Yeah.
um, for this journal. It's in short, I would say that sort of following Bishop's generous orthodox approach to modern culture and Catholic tradition. That this is the project of the New Ressourcement is to be Catholic, deeply Catholic and theological, and that means to draw from the riches of the tradition from all eras and not neglecting any. And that's a key important part. A lot of times, Catholic theologians in the 20th century have wanted to kind of make their hobby horse theologian or era the totality of Catholic theology.
Right.
Um, and one of the convictions of the New Ressourcement is that that sort of thing is a mistake. Certainly don't want to uh, cut out and exclude the wisdom of any era or thinker or school within the tradition. I think having all of those at our disposal is what makes Catholic theology so especially rich. Um, and in my personal experience, um, when uh, when a when a group or a community starts to carve out parts of their tradition, eliminate things, and narrow it down to some fundamentalist tenet or set of tenets, or some the result is always something more impoverished and more narrow and infertile
Yeah.
than what they came from. This is to me the sort of essential logic of sectarianism. um, rejecting, rejecting. It's always a sort of exclusionary logic that narrows down what's important in the tradition and excludes all the other stuff. Now, there's a certain way that we do have to, as theologians, as Catholics in the modern world, there's certain ways that we do have to be sort of discerning when we return to the tradition and find resources for the present and the future. We can't, we can't just simply work like a museum and try to keep everything exactly as it was. And no, we need to find ways to take the wisdom and richness of the tradition and renew it, make it something living today, not a museum piece, not some relic. Um, we are modern Catholics. We live in the 21st century, and we can't pretend like we don't. Um, but but finding the way to do that, so in a way that doesn't deny the present and the future, uh, or the past. And that's, I think that Bishop Barron, he's Catholic in the sense of that he wants to be uh, he wants to be all of these things, truly Catholic, respectful, and appropriately attentive to the past, while also acknowledging that the world is different, we are different, and the demands of our life today are different. And so Catholicism today needs to be different, needs to look different. But what does it look like to still be Catholic in the 21st century? And that's the sort of the new ressourcement. It's honoring the past, but it's doing it in a new way, and it's retrieving tradition, not as though it's some kind of lifeless item in a museum, but something that we are living out today in a new way.
We're gonna explore the journal in our final segment, but it truly is. I love the notion of not wanting it to be a a museum with kind of these old, kind of irrelevant pieces that are on more for the sake of curiosity. You're looking at that for curiosity's sake, as opposed to something that is alive and well and relevant and central to living a good and holy life here and now. So it's extraordinary. Segment 2, the ressourcement. In Mystery and Manners, Flannery O'Connor confessed, quote, writing a novel is a terrible experience during which the hair often falls out and the teeth decay, close quote. So, Jason, while your hairline looks strong and your teeth in good form, I wish I could say the same about my hairline, but alas, I imagine that Flannery's words are somewhat relatable when it comes to creating and editing a journal. The new Ressourcement, as we've talked about, Word on Fire's quarterly academic journal of philosophy and theology, is now available for enthusiastic seekers. But before we delve into the journal, the new Ressourcement, let's talk about the original Ressourcement. So, you've already defined ressourcement, return to the sources. I've mentioned it in my opening lines as well. But what did the ressourcement in the 20th century mean?
Well, you sort of have to understand it, I think, in its historical context and in the context of the 19th century Catholicism in the 19th century. There's a lot that was, there's a lot to say about Catholicism in the 19th century, but it was a time of intense change. It's probably we think of our era as being sort of the zenith of everything, zenith of the most radical change, and it certainly is that. But the 19th century for the Catholic Church has to be one of the most turbulent periods, and 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 if you can imagine, at the beginning of the 19th century, the church was like a sovereign in a way. It's like a sovereign nation, controlled these states and papal states in Italian in the Italian peninsula. So the church was struggling to sort of survive in the modern world in the form it had developed, and had throughout the Middle Ages. Um, but the world was changing so quickly. Large nation states emerging and becoming very nationalistic, and of course, the Italian peninsula was always um, clamoring for reunification, sort of like take all of these different little kingdoms that were operating in Italy and combine them into a massive state, like what was happening elsewhere. The church was also under a lot of criticism, and it was sort of there was throughout modernity. The church has often been um, derided as a kind of ancient institution that was in the way of progress. Um, so the church in general is just on so many fronts was finding itself under attack. It's legitimacy challenged, its authority challenged, and like on every front, the philosophers are challenging it, political movements in Europe are challenging it, and it's fighting to hold on to its identity and its sort of authority and its place in European society, and sort of losing hand over fist. And really, this sort of comes to a head in the middle of the century when the Italian reunification movement kind of sacks the Vatican and takes over all of these papal states, and claims them for the new Italian state that was emerging. So that the church lost its political power. It was losing its intellectual authority to all these philosophers who were challenging it. Sort of a theory of evolution's emerging. There's just its moral authority is under attack, um, and the church during that period was just struggling to figure out how to handle all of these threats from the modern world. um, and the sort of solution that kind of emerges in the end of the 19th century is Thomism. But it's that bring back Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas had the philosophical prowess to address all of these modern problems and challenges from because at that time, Catholics rightly understood that a lot of these political and social challenges to the church were deriving from a fundamental philosophical and theological challenge, that had been sort of in play for a long time. So they said, bring back Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is the one who can answer all of these challenges and correct all these philosophical errors. And that's what the church did. That's what we see this encyclical by Pope Leo XIII, Aeterni Patris, where Thomas Aquinas is held up as a sort of pillar of Catholic wisdom. He's a representative figure, and the whole church should study him. And so for the next decades, entering the 20th century, this is the approach the church takes, and increasingly it starts to become a kind of sort of siege philosophy. Thomas Aquinas becomes the anti-modern Catholic thinker. He's he combats modernity, and increasingly Thomism is, and a lot of this is, of course, it's anachronistic. Thomas Aquinas wasn't an anti-modern anything. He wasn't fighting with the modern world. We put him to work in that way, and sometimes it's necessary to stand athwart modern culture and say no, and be sort of critical. But what the Ressourcement fathers of the middle of the century, right after the wars, saw was that what had emerged out of this movement to retrieve Thomas Aquinas and resource Thomas Aquinas was something purely defensive, or overly defensive at least, something that was digging a trench around an ancient fortification and fighting with all its might to resist any incursion from the world, to resist any assimilation of any kind, resist any engagement. And after the Second World War, there was this radical sea change. The whole world, I mean, there was a question about during the 19th century and the early 20th century, but sometimes it's called the long 19th century, whether uh, how the world was going to go, whether we were going to go back to some kind of older regime, a political cultural regime or not. After the Second World War, there was no question the modern world is here to stay, and the old regime was dead. It wasn't coming back,
Mm.
and a lot of people thought that Thomism was somehow connected to that dying ancient regime. Um, and that Catholicism was going to also suffer that same fate if it just insisted on that posture toward the modern world. Now,
Mm.
none of like I'm not saying that this is an accurate, historically fair uh, view of Thomism. I don't think Thomism needs to be viewed that way. I don't think Thomism is a purely defensive doctrine. But at the time, there was a much more strident anti-modern kind of sense, sort of Thomism. And it wasn't, to be fair to these Thomists, I mean, they're people like Reginald Lagrange, who's kind of an arch figure in this movement. He's not merely anti-modern. He's a complex figure, and that we
Mhm.
can't boil him down to like an anti-modern type. And I think that's
Right.
been a narrative that has caused a lot of trouble and stuff, and it's been unfair. But the point is that these ressourcement fathers thought that the posture of the church and its theologians was too negative toward the modern world and too oppositional, too adversarial, and it needed to enter a more dialogical kind of stance vis-a-vis the modern world, and it also needed to just broaden its historical and its horizons. We need to study Thomas Aquinas, but we need to recognize that Thomas Aquinas it is just part of this grand tradition that we belong to. And so we need to also go back to this, we need to read the other medievals, and we need to go back to these sources, the scripture, the early fathers, and realize that these are the scriptures and the early fathers are resources and a heritage that we have in common with our Protestant brothers.
Mhm.
And increasingly there was an interest in having more dialogue with Protestants. And so, in a lot of ways, the new ressourcement, the original ressourcement movement of the 20th century represents this interest in changing our posture, the Catholic posture towards the modern world, less defensive, more dialogical, interested in being more relevant, because these ressourcement fathers saw Catholic defensiveness as the best recipe for its own obsolescence.
Mm.
Catholicism was disappearing from the scene and other things were taking its place, and what a shame that was, because the Catholic intellectual tradition has been such an important formative thing for the Western intellectual world, since the beginning. It's sort of the cradle of Western intellectual tradition, you might say. So they wanted to be more relevant, and they wanted to be more engaged with the modern world, and they just thought that having a more nuanced and wide-ranging approach, and retrieval of the Catholic tradition was the way to do that. So sorry, that's a really
No,
long-winded
that's why, I mean,
description.
anybody who wants that's no, it's exactly what I was looking for. So one question I wanna ask is, so was the ressourcement, was that actually led from the highest levels in the church, or was there a movement within the church that sort of catalyzed that? What's your sense about that?
My sense is that it was mostly a grassroots movement. In fact, at
Sure.
first it was, it faced some skepticism and suspicions, from the sort of from Rome and Roman officials, initial in the late 40s, early 50s. Some of the ressourcement fathers actually came under censure, or came under suspicion at least. And there was a bit of a reaction to them at that point. And it wasn't really until Vatican II that the sort of the character and place of this ressourcement movement um, was approved sort of implicitly by the council, which took them, sort of drew on a lot of their theological ideas for its defining documents. Um, so yeah, it was more of a bottom up movement. A lot of a lot of its leading figures were Jesuits, some Dominicans, um, but it certainly wasn't like a top down kind of
Sure.
imposed thing. Yeah.
Could you just offer a few names? I mean, people are going to be surprised, I'm sure, that they're like, "Oh, that's I know that person. I know that person." A few of the names of the Ressourcement fathers, as you see them from the post-war era.
I would say some of the key figures were, of course, Henri de Lubac, a great patristic scholar and Thomist of a certain stripe. Um, Jean Danielou, another French Jesuit who was instrumental in um, kind of advancing patristic scholarship and developing translations and critical editions of a lot of the fathers' writings. Yves Congar is a Dominican Thomist historian. He was an important figure in the movement. Of course, Joseph Ratzinger. He's sort of a part of a later cohort of them, but I think he was a very important figure for that kind of thought for sure. Yeah, and there were a number of others that you know I think those are sort of some of the key
Yeah.
figures, but there were a number of others that played different kinds of roles. But yeah.
How did the Thomists respond to this?
I think, yeah, again, I want to be careful to avoid typecasting and
Sure.
stereotyping. There were definitely some anxieties from the
Mhm.
Thomist camp. And again, Thomist is a very loose and ill-defined word. And during this period, Thomism is a school of thought that kind of emerged in the 19th century.
Okay.
It was defined in the 19th century, and a lot of what we call Thomism is historically less rooted in Thomas Aquinas and rooted more in Baroque scholasticism and people
Mm,
like Francisco Suarez and Juan de Lugo and others who were 17th century, really very much modern Thomist inspired but very eclectic figures. Um, so that the Thomism, what we call Thomism in the early 20th century, is not simply medieval, and it's not simply anti-modern. In many ways, it's modern thought
sure.
itself, and it's not strictly the thought of Thomas Aquinas. It's the thought of Thomas Aquinas as interpreted and developed by his commentators, his later early modern Spanish and Iberian commentators. Um, that's not to criticize the tradition; it's just sort of to kind of understand its historical roots. But but yeah, that was a sort of canonical Thomism of the early 20th century, and a lot of Thomism, a lot of Thomists rightly felt threatened by. They saw the work of people like Jean Danielou, uh, this patristic, this turn to the fathers, as a way of saying turn away from Thomas Aquinas, turn away
Mm,
from the commentators, and inevitably that is sort of was part of the message of the ressourcement movement, to be fair. And there were several of the ressourcement fathers whose explicit goal was to sort of overturn the Thomist hegemony of the 20th century. That was their
mm,
goal, at least for some of them. So the Thomists weren't totally wrong to feel like they were under attack. Um, and you know, it, the Thomists, they were sort of more institutionalized. Rome was much more friendly to that was sort of like they found they had support of the magisterium and stuff. So in one way of looking at it, they sort of had this massive advantage over the ressourcement Nouvelle Theologie guys. But in reality, the power that proved to be more decisive was the culture, the power of culture that was transforming. And this new approach to theology just proved to be much more it proved to be more consonant with the transformations that Europe and the West was undergoing during this time, and the kind of new culture that was emerging in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. So it, it won out, but I don't think, one of the things that I think is kind of unhelpful is when we sort of oversimplify this
Yeah, yeah.
story and treat the Thomists as if they were simply one thing, and they simply simply a relic of the past, and they were simply opposed to modernity, and it's a bit too simple. But that this sort of, there's some version of that is true. There's some truth in it, at least. Um, but yeah, so I think, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, very, very well. And obviously, Thomas Aquinas still looms very large in a very good way, offers so much to our modern understanding of our Catholic theology to this very day. It strikes me, it strikes me that first of all, I remember reading the young Joseph Ratzinger talking about, returning to the sources and reading Augustine and Bonaventure and others, and how he felt like it breathed such new life into the theology that he was learning, that it was like there was this vibrancy, this enlivening spirit that had come into what had sort of devolved a little bit to a more dusty, kind of highly academic, highly intellectual, kind of questionably fully applicable theology. And so it was just this invigorating way he represented the return to the sources. My question following on that kind of a testimony is, again, you told a little bit about how Thomism became a little bit of the rebuttal in the midst of an onslaught of ideologies and worldly powers and so on and so forth. But is it surprising to you that the sources kind of got forgotten a little bit along the way?
Yeah, I think there was a tendency among some Thomists to think that, to think in sort of progressive terms, to say that all of the good stuff and important stuff from the fathers had been encapsulated and embodied and reflected in its most sophisticated, most nuanced and rich way in the work of the modern Thomists. So you didn't need to go back to the fathers. You didn't need to read them firsthand. You could get everything that was good in them in its most sophisticated and elaborate form in the scholastics.
Mm,
And of course, the Ressourcement fathers rejected that kind of thinking, and they thought that, in fact, in modern scholasticism had become rather narrow. Sorry, modern scholasticism had become rather narrow,
mhm,
um, and unpalatable. It sort of clung to sort of crusty nomenclature and style of writing. The way theology was done was just sort of assertive, in terms of these manuals that were just sort of like reading encyclopedias of doctrine and dogma,
mhm,
all
mhm.
sort of authoritative, like this is how it is, this is how it is, this is how it is. Not a whole lot of like argumentation and thought and reflection and analysis. A lot of that, it was in there. There were a lot of Thomists who were doing that kind of work, but the sort of stuff that, mm, the literature that is most representative of what the Ressourcement fathers were rejecting is the manual, um, the kind of manual it has a purpose, and usually its purpose was to train seminarians, to give them sort of the doctrinal foundations, um, on which they could work with which they could work
Sure.
and teach. Um, but the one of the things that we see, I think, in the Ressourcement fathers is a much more literary sensibility. They're much more, to be honest, they're much more pleasant to read. They write much more beautiful. I mean, Joseph Ratzinger is just an amazing writer.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things they recognize is that the medium, the form, is as important as the matter, the content. So it's not enough to just teach Catholic doctrine. You've got to make it intelligible, and you've
Mm,
got to make it palatable. You've got to make it, for the people who are supposed to be reading it. And so if it's just this sort of, bland, heavily Latin and Germanic, um, kind of shorthand. It's almost like another language,
Yeah.
Latglish or something. And there's still a lot of this. I have to say, as an editor, in Catholic theology, there is a lot of there's some Ressourcement fathers who called it sawdust Thomism, because it was like consuming. It was just like putting sawdust in your mouth and chewing on it and swallowing. It was just horrible. It's just really hard to consume. Difficult to just keep reading that stuff, as good and wholesome as it often was. But so they recognized that the beauty of the Catholic intellectual tradition wasn't sort of making it into the mix anymore. Um, and they saw, I think Augustine is one of the most extraordinary rhetorical writers. Um, and he was rhetorical for a reason. It was an important part of his message. It was inseparable from his theology and his influence. He sort of shaped the whole medieval Catholic world. But to sort of end up with just formulations and just bland formulations that are, that we sort of memorize the form, the words, and we've sort of lost a sense of what they, often what they mean, um, what the deeper meaning of it is. We sort of focus on the formulas and stuff. And again, this doesn't represent the whole Thomist early 20th century Thomist school. They were a broad group, and we have to do justice to that fact. And some of them had very mystical. Even Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange and had his very mystical bent, and he could be a very evocative writer when he wanted to be. And there were others like Matthias Joseph Schaben, a German theologian whom I've studied in my dissertation, my doctoral work. He could be a very manualistic writer, and sometimes his writing is like it's like eating sawdust. But other times he's just a very evocative, profound, rich writer in different works. So I think that I as much as possible I try not to narrow the story down too much. I think the Ressourcement fathers had a point, and I think that the Thomists, in some ways, have been unfairly um, sort of pigeonholed and shoeboxed in the received narrative. Um, but that in some way there's truth in both. But I do think that the Ressourcement fathers, uh, their argument was really essential for the world that we live in as Catholics today. We cannot be um, we can't we have to be engaged with our tradition. We have to be deeply engaged and nourished by our tradition. But how do we do that? We can't do that like curators who just keep the form and just like you know collect things. We can't
Yeah.
do it like larpers who are pretending to be part of an age that they're not actually in, and
Mm.
acting out and sort of like hiding from the modern world. We are moderners. We're not if you pick up like a broadsword and put on a suit of armor, that does not make you medieval.
Yeah.
It's makes you a modern guy with a sword and a suit of armor. Um, so it's important for us to know to determine what it is to be Catholic, what it is to be steeped and informed by tradition as a modern person.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of aspiration that I think um, was animating a lot of what the Ressourcement fathers were after. And I think it's a message and um, it's a project that we need to carry forward today and always. It's reform and renew the tradition without losing it.
Jason, let me ask you, given the aims of what the Ressourcement was striving for, would you say that they have succeeded?
No, I think you have to say that they provided a lot of terrific food for thought, and they did a lot to transform the Catholic world, Catholic culture, and Catholic thought. But that if their goal was to re-inject Catholic thought into the mainstream modern Western culture, if their goal was to make Catholic thought as relevant today in the modern world as it was in the medieval, for instance, then they surely didn't succeed there. The world is, the sort of public space and this public intellectual space is far more indifferent and far more secular and atheistic than it was even in their time. In fact, in the 1950s, there was a kind of surprising boom of interest in Christianity and Catholicism and religion in general, and they were sort of living amid that boom. And you can sort of see it in some of their really what today seem like hyper optimistic uh, assessments of the world that they lived in, and where it was headed. Um, and in some ways their sort of sensibility is dated because it's perhaps too wedded to intellectual fashions that disappeared shortly thereafter, like the importance of Marxism, for instance, and the importance of existentialism. Existentialism was like the intellectual water that everyone was swimming in during those times, and it's sort of gone by the way to a significant extent today. It's certainly not as important to us today as it was then. And so, I mean, there's certain aspects of their theology and their sensibility that's a bit dated now, as it has to be. If you're sort of living in your moment, engaging with the intellectual currents of your time, they're always going to be more or less temporary. And so you are inevitably doing something that's going to be outdated at some point before too long, maybe very soon. But that's just the sort of way that tradition works. It always sort of has to enter into a new key, a new register, a new cultural idiom and medium, in order to continue to be itself, to be true to itself. I think in a way that's not a criticism to say that in some ways their project came to an end or failed or didn't fully realize its aspiration. I don't think any aspiration of that kind and of that it's a grand aspiration in a way. I don't think it's the kind of thing that can just sort of succeed once and for all. So it needs to be sort of constantly in play. The church needs to constantly be reformed. Its thought needs to constantly be reformed, constantly engaged, never resting on its laurels, never triumphalistic. So just sort of like I guess one of the purposes of the new Ressourcement is to remember all of that.
Hi, I'm Tod Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, the new Ressourcement. Visiting Word on Fire's new Ressourcement website, which, by the way, is new Ressourcement, like new ressourcement.wordonfire.org, one encounters this mission statement, quote, "This journal aims to sentire cum tota ecclesia, to think with the whole church as it has ever reflected on the mystery of the incarnate Christ, as seen in sources that are biblical, patristic, medieval, as well as modern. The journal draws inspiration from and seeks to continue the work of previous generations of Ressourcement theologians. It shares with them a conviction that the renewal of theology and philosophy occurs by returning to sources that remain inexhaustible. This Ressourcement is new because we trust that this patrimony is fertile enough to encounter contemporary questions confidently and to illuminate the challenges and opportunities that shape the present age, close quote. So, Jason, in a paperless age of uber modernity, you created a print journal exploring tradition. What were you thinking?
um, yeah, I just can't believe that the print medium is ever going to fully die. But the
Amen.
digital format is important, and we are going to provide that too. It's not available on the website just yet, but we're working on that. And before long, subscribers will be able to access current and past issues and essays, and to read them, download them, print them out, use them for research purposes or whatever. And our journalists were working on circulating through academic databases like JSTOR and Atla, things like that. So we value the digital media and are very much interested in creating a modern digital edition of our journal as well as the print edition. But we also think that there's a kind of classic character of the printed book. We are people of the book, we Christians, and I just don't think that, could be wrong. I don't think that the print medium is going away. So we've really invested also in the print edition of our journal, the materials, the sort of quality of the typesetting. We have just some really terrific designers working on every aspect of the journal. So it's meant to be read in both ways. A lot of scholars today just sort of consume academic journals on digitally. They sort of find they don't read things. They don't read issues from cover to cover. They sort of find a particular essay and they print that one out. And they read that one and they don't really even care what journal it came from. We aim to serve scholars who work that way, but we also aim to serve readers who like to sit down and read a book from cover to cover. So we make our journals. We invest in the materials, we invest in the typesetting, and we lovingly care for every detail of our prints. We proofread very carefully. We're on Fire Publishing is sort of famous for the quality um, of our of our productions, both in terms of the editorial quality, free from errors, and um, professionally typeset, um, care and attention paid to the font and the way that the books are designed. And then also the materials, the presentation, the aesthetics of our publications are also very important. And we have world-class design team who I can't thank enough for their terrific work here. Michael Stevens, I have to mention him. He is the sort of genius designer behind the new Ressourcement, and Roseanne Lee too, the senior director of the design department. She's been instrumental, and they've just done terrific work. So this is a journal that you can read with your hands and your pencil. I always teach my kids that it's the pencil that does the reading. It's
Right on.
so yeah, you gotta read with a pencil if you really want to retain things.
So for those listeners out there, I love to tease Jason about the print journal, only because about 20 issues ago, I was asked to do the same thing with a journal, with the Evangelization Culture, the Journal of the Word on Fire Institute, and I could not agree with you more, Jason. I remember working with that extraordinary design team that you just mentioned, Roseanne Lee and Cassie Bielak, and now Claire Sheaf. Um, the going originally to samples of covers, samples of pages, the glossiness of the page, the size of the prints, just the whole design notion. And that, again, we are people of the book. We are sacramental people where there's a
Yes.
meeting of the physical world with the spiritual. And I can say, first of all, your journal it is beautiful. And second of all, I could say for our journal, we like to pride ourselves on the beauty of it as well. And the reception that there has been, for at least I could say for our journal so far, and I know for yours, people are tired of reading stuff online. Not that shouldn't be an adjunct, but people like to sit down, open something up, feel it, palpate it, mark it up like you've described. And so it's sort of countercultural, but it's strikingly relevant to so many people's lives. As far as I can see, tons and tons of books are still flying off the shelves. Not everybody has an e-reader, so to speak. So long live print journalism. I want to ask you, Jason, again, not to make a too big of a question, but as you're entering into the fray of producing an academic journal, how would you describe the state of academic, theological, and philosophical debate in the 21st century? Are you entering um, a burgeoning landscape, or is it a desert landscape? Has there been a lull in debate and discussion on all things theological and philosophical? Are we in a dry time, or is it an exploding time of incredible ferment? What's your sense about that?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of a mix. There's a real mixed story here, because I do think that there is incredible creativity and a ferment and interesting stuff going on all over the place. Especially, and I'm American, obviously, so I know more about the American scene, and I think there's a lot of great stuff also happening in Europe. I've heard about things happening in Spain and Poland and elsewhere. But to me, there's just such a rich uh, cast of extraordinary thinkers in the United States that are doing terrific work in theology, and I'm just sort of grateful to be able to be sort of ride on the coattails of these people by publishing them and giving them a medium and an outlet to publish their terrific work. Really, a lot of what a lot of the plan for our business plan is really just um, to farm out, to ride on the coattails of authors. That's really what a
Yeah,
publisher does. It just, sort of profits from profits from the genius of other people.
yeah,
And I think that's maybe the recipe for a successful journal, is to not do everything yourself, but to find the right people and get them together and let them make something. And that's really, I think, what we've done. I mean, we brought together, first and foremost, I got to shout out to Matthew Levering and Jonathan Serrallo and Father Aaron Pidell. They are our executive editorial staff. They are the real brains and leaders of the journal, and they're just a terrific bunch that have done so much to shape the journal, give it a sense of direction, a real concrete sense of direction, and bring in just a tremendous group of people to be friends and part of the kind of movement of the journal. And that's, it's this sort of social aspect of a journal is part of why we approach the journal as in conjunction with a yearly and annual conference, and where we bring these people together, and we're trying to get them to to build something together. We're just trying to put them in the same room to get them
yeah.
speaking together. Because, yeah, I mean, one thing that I will say about the theologians is that they can tend to be a fairly tribal bunch.
Mm,
They're doing different things, and sometimes wildly different things, and sometimes they can't really they can't really appreciate and under or fully understand what's going on in another sector of the theological ecology, and I think it's important for the Catholic character of our journal and of our broader Catholic scholarly world for us to be in communication. And I think good things happen when these people working in different kind of domains of the Catholic theological and philosophical world are to work together and are overhearing and eavesdropping on each other's work a little bit. So we're emphatically biblical, emphatically patristic, emphatically systematic and historical. We're trying to bring all of those elements together, and hopefully these scholars are cross pollinating and sort of enriching each other's work, um, and that intellectual ferment. I think it's very powerful. I mean, I we talked about my experience in discovering a book,
yeah.
and my discovery of the richness of the Catholic intellectual tradition, and I think that richness is really about um, culture. It's about bringing things together and watching them grow together. So my hope is that the new Ressourcement would just be sort of a big tent where a lot of terrific, faithful Catholic scholars can meet and discuss their ideas together and learn from each other and produce something that's greater than the sum of their individual contributions somehow.
Wonderful. As we wind down here, Jason, I did want to say that as you mentioned, you had the first new Ressourcement conference held in late 2023. I'm holding a copy of the product of that in front of me, and you've got everything from Father Brian Dunkel writing on justice, power, and persuasion in patristic accounts of Christ's victory over Satan. You have Bishop Barron writing what's new about the new Ressourcement, the changed circumstances of a perennial project of retrieval. D.C. Schindler writing a Ressourcement as a transformation of the world. Angela Franks grasping the form, a proposal for contemplative and synthetic systematic theology. And Tracy Rowland, principles for a new Ressourcement in a time of crisis, among many others that are in here, plus book reviews. It's an intellectual feast. It's a gorgeous work that's just a pleasure to hold in your hands and to kind of go through. I gave the website earlier for people if they want to get copies of this. Can you tell us also a little bit? This is the spring issue. What can people expect in the summer issue coming up?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so we were just finishing up work actually on the summer issue, and it'll be arriving in mailboxes sometime at the end of June. I would say probably like the 22nd, maybe to the 24th. You should be getting it in your mailbox at that point. Um, in the summer issue, we've got in a way a lot of the same um, characteristics and themes that you saw in the first edition. A star-studded bunch of scholars. We've got an essay from Michael Barber from the Augustine Institute, from our very own Jonathan Saraulo, who teaches at St. Meinrad's, and they're writing on topics as diverse as the priestly keys in Matthew 16 and biblical hermeneutics and exegesis. This is Joshua Madden's contribution. He's a terrific essay there. Jonathan Saraulo has a really, really terrific essay on romanticism and its relationship to the sacraments and the sacramental imagination. Matthew Levering also has contributed an essay that sort of explores the challenges of being a faithful Catholic theologian and being also sort of critical. His essay is titled Faithful Catholic Theologian, and also sort of engaging critically with this magisterial teaching. His essay is called, he'll probably hate my description of his essay, but it's called Mother Church, Can Receptivity Be Squared with Resistance? And he's sort of trying to find the balance between, sort of being sort of subject to the authority of the magisterium, and also being sort of creatively and critically engaged with the magisterium and its teaching. And then we've got a great essay also by Margaret McCarthy. Again, a lot of these essays are working on something like the broad concept of the new Ressourcement, and Margaret's essay does that. And others are working on a more focused on a more particular issue of biblical exegesis or intellectual history. But yeah, these essays are terrific, and they're sure to to stimulate and edify in any case.
Finally, Jason, how have you personally been changed by the work you've done with Word on Fire Academic, but also especially the new Ressourcement?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think I've been humbled a lot to be in touch with so many great scholars and thinkers. I've really grown, sort of developed a personal connection to a lot of the leading lights of the Catholic theological world, and I'm just so grateful to be sort of in the room with these people. They're just such extraordinary people on every level. I mean, they're brilliant thinkers, but they're also theologians. If they're sort of worth, if they're really true theologians, they're also sort of deeply committed, faithful Christians, and watching them is like, you're sort of learning on two levels. So you're sort of watching, in many cases, very holy, devout people. And again, it's like me getting a glimpse of that human flourishing that I've been after for my whole adult life. So being the editor of Word on Fire Academic has just brought me in contact with just the kind of people that I've been trying to get into contact with for since I found Mere Christianity. So I'm so grateful for that. And then I just have a job where I'm kind of like sifting through some of the greatest writers and thinkers of our age. So it's just a tremendously fulfilling and stimulating just thing to do. I consider it a dream job, and a gift from God. I'm so grateful to be here.
Dr. Jason Paone, thinker, theologian, and editor of the new Ressourcement. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you too, Todd. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for having me. And I want to thank also our subscribers. We've got like over 4,000 subscribers at this point. We are so humbled and blessed to have you. And we are so grateful that you have chosen to be part of this project and this movement. Thank you.
So I've been thinking. In his memoirs, Milestones, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, wrote, quote, "In the fall of 1949, Alfred Lappel had given me Catholicism, perhaps Henri de Lubac's most significant work, in the masterful translation by Hans Urs von Balthasar. This book was for me a key reading event. It gave me not only a new and deeper connection with the thought of the fathers, but also a new way of looking at theology and faith as such. Faith had here become an interior contemplation, and precisely by thinking with the fathers, a present reality." Close quote. Ressourcement, return to the sources. Reading about some of the formation of Catholic seminarians in the middle of the 20th century, it is easy to see where a certain amount of the reading could become dusty, dry, and formulaic. Young priests had a hunger for the feast of the faith, a desire for what G.K. Chesterton called, quote, "one whirling adventure where the heavenly chariot flies thundering through the ages, the dull heresies sprawling and prostrate, the wild truth reeling but erect," close quote. To reclaim the whirling adventure required a broader vision where the totality of the Catholic faith was drawn in. It wasn't just St. Thomas Aquinas, major councils, and recent encyclicals and exhortations that enlivened the faith, but the lives and thought and faith of St. Augustine and St. Anselm, St. Ambrose and St. Athanasius, St. Bonaventure and St. Pope Gregory the Great. It was an intellectual and mystical feast with the communion of saints. Upon converting to Catholicism in 2010, I was struck by the church's vastness as well as its depth. As Chesterton marveled, quote, "There is no other case of one continuous intelligent institution that has been thinking about thinking for 2,000 years, close quote. With this in mind and with prayer often on my lips, I have become heartened by the conversation, aid, and comfort I routinely receive from the intercessions of these giants of the faith, giants who are my brothers and sisters as well as my advocates with the Lord of the universe. Dizzy with fellowship, it made perfect sense to discover Benedict XVI's enthusiasm for rich community with the Church Fathers. Our faith is a living, breathing thing. It is an encounter with Christ, not a dusty theoretical proposition or a sleek paradigm for living. As such, shouldn't we all live vibrantly in the now while being enriched by Catholicism's modern and ancient sources? Of course we should. So let's pray fervently, partake in the sacraments, and plead for the intercession of the saints that have come before us. And while we are at it, let's read Word on Fire's new academic journal, the new Ressourcement, and begin anew ourselves. And one last thing. To be sure, get a copy of the first and second editions of Word on Fire's academic journal, the new Ressourcement. But also dive into the works of the thinkers from the original Ressourcement movement in the middle of the 20th century. In particular, I would recommend Henri de Lubac's The Drama of Atheist Ecumenism, Hans Urs von Balthasar's first volume, of the Theodrama. And for good measure, read Richard Decloux's The Mind of Benedict XVI, which explores the faith and thought of a Ressourcement Pope. Enliven your faith. Return to the sources. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Tod Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.